The iPhone 4S. That's the phone I lived with for an entire week, 7 years after it came out. It would be a definite understatement to say that it was a bit rough. The iPhone 4S has probably aged the worst of any iPhone out there, and going from the iPhone XS to the 4S wasn't exactly fun. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I lived with the iPhone 4S for an entire week. So let's talk about my experience and whether or not the phone is truly obsolete. Spoiler, it kind of is. So really quickly gonna interject here. This video is looking like it's gonna be pretty long. So down in the description, there'll be kind of a table of contents type thing with timestamps for each aspect of the iPhone 4S I'll be going over. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you maybe went and followed me over on Twitter and Instagram at 91_tech. Direct links to my social media in the description. I'm super close to 1,000 followers on Twitter, so if I could hit that, that would be amazing. Also, I post a lot of tech stuff, and I talked a lot about the 4S when I was using it, so if that interests you, maybe give me a follow. And with that necessary plug out of the way, let's talk about the iPhone 4S. I think the best way to describe the iPhone 4S is like you have a car that can only drive up to 30 kilometers an hour. When it comes to residential areas, school zones, or in town, you're more or less okay, but once you get onto any main road or a highway, you feel like driving off a bridge, and that's kind of like using the 4S. It can do stuff, just really slowly. The more basic the task, the better it works. Texting and calling? Absolutely fine. Biggest complaint I have is that I can't see certain emojis, so there's that. But at least I have a real gun again, obviously worth it. The keyboard is annoying to type on because of the small screen, which I'll talk about in a bit, but that's basically my only complaint with that. There's also a huge variation in performance app to app. Instagram and Netflix are surprisingly usable. Instagram kind of makes sense as there's really nothing to load but pictures, but Netflix I thought for sure would be excruciating given how much it has to load. But it's not bad and definitely completely usable. Twitter was also pretty okay. I'd rate it worse than the others considering all it has to do is load mostly text, but I was still able to use it without much difficulty. Unfortunately, not all apps are this well optimized, with the best example of a steaming hot pile of garbage being YouTube. I know, that's a surprise, right? YouTube being bad? Who'd have ever thunk it? YouTube would freeze at the drop of a hat, and trying to watch anything was insanely difficult. Once you got the video loaded, it was fine, but closing it is when the problems start. It's just so slow. It was actually faster to force close the app, then reopen it and find a new video. Needless to say, I didn't watch as much YouTube this week as I normally would, which is probably a good thing. Also, I noticed something a bit odd about this phone. There's this weird little hole at the top of the device, and I can't seem to figure out what it is or why it's there. Yeah, a little strange. Also, another problem, my dongle doesn't seem to fit anywhere. Alright, I jest, but the iPhone 4S does have a headphone jack, and that did make media consumption kind of enjoyable. Bit of a throwback for me, as I've been without a jack for quite a while at this point. I was able to use nicer headphones with Spotify, which actually worked pretty well on the 4S. That said, I still 100% prefer AirPods, and I'll give up a bit of sound quality for convenience any day. You technically can use AirPods with the 4S, just by using them as any Bluetooth device, but I didn't bother because I wanted the full experience. You might be wondering how I managed to actually use all these apps on this phone, considering the 4S looks like it's on an old piece of software. Well, luckily, Apple actually lets you download the latest compatible version of an app if you've downloaded it before, and because iOS 8 was only dropped support for fairly recently by most big apps, I got mostly modern versions of YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and so on. This was helpful, and it didn't really feel like I was using a 7-year-old phone, except for the speed size and basically everything else about it. Let's quickly go over software. I'm using iOS 8.2 on this device. Now this is partly cheating, as it's impossible to downgrade to 8.2, but you can get to 8.4.1 and there isn't much difference besides the music icon. I actually did a video on how to downgrade your 4S if you want to see it, link in the description. Normally a 4S goes to iOS 9.3.5 for those who didn't know. iOS 8 is better because it's not quite as slow. I was going to downgrade to 8.4.1, but the phone that I used last year here wasn't working with my SIM card even after downgrading, so I figured I'd just use this one. And this one was just never updated past 8.2, and I didn't see the point of updating it. So I got it unlocked through TELUS, and it worked perfectly fine, unlike the last phone. Oh, and in case I haven't mentioned it yet, I lived with the iPhone 4S last year as well. Why do it twice? I don't know. Maybe I subconsciously hate myself or something like that. I don't know. iOS 8.2 has interesting quirks here and there, but it isn't really too different from what we see today. The music icon is different, as mentioned earlier, but I use Spotify anyways. I would say that it's actually pretty easy to go from iOS 12 to iOS 7, 8, 9, etc., as there really haven't been that many changes except for some small UI ones. Everything still mostly feels the same. You still have the control center, notification center, relatively modern versions of apps, although going back to slide to unlock felt pretty weird. I mean, I guess I slide up to unlock my iPhone XS, but it's definitely not the same thing. So we've gone over the software aspect of things pretty well here, but still need to go over the hardware, as well as my overall takeaway from the week. So let's start this simple with the design. The iPhone 4S is gorgeous, at least in my opinion. It's pretty obvious the iPhone X took a lot of inspiration from the 4S, and that's definitely a good thing. We have a stainless steel frame and a glass back. This is a super modern design that Apple had nailed all the way back in 2010 and 2011. That's crazy to me. Obviously, we don't have wireless charging here though, which is pretty much the whole point of glass nowadays, other than looking good. So it makes sense Apple ended up switching over to aluminum with the iPhone 5. The charger is one you probably remember, and if you're anything like me, you probably have a ton just stuffed into various drawers around the house. And I mean, while the charger is nostalgic and everything, it's actually pretty inconvenient. People made a huge stink when they made the switch over to the Lightning with the iPhone 5, but in hindsight, I am so glad they did it. You can only plug these chargers in one way, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't accidentally try to jam it in the wrong way multiple times. Whenever you plug in the phone, it vibrates, which is fine because phones still do that now, but that segues us into the next thing I want to talk about. I had forgotten how bad these old vibration motors are. Every time you get a text, it sounds like a bus crashed through your window. I just kind of thought it was funny. I think the vibrating is actually louder than the text tone, and man, am I glad that it's so much more subtle now. The speakers are pretty much garbage on the iPhone 4S, as you would expect, but again, headphone jack, so no complaints here. Something I kind of liked but hated at the same time was the size. The 4S is small with a 3.5-inch display, and it's pretty brutal to use. I liked the compactness of it and being able to use it with one hand, as that isn't nearly as easy on my XS, but everything else was a general pain. There's so little screen real estate. I know this was Steve Jobs' perfect phone size, and maybe it was for the time, but definitely not 7 years later. I could never fully get used to the small screen, which is interesting because when I switch over to the iPhone 5S or SE, it actually feels pretty natural. My guess is that it's because of the 4S's aspect ratio. It's a little bit weird at 3:2 instead of your typical 16:9 widescreen, and it kind of feels off. Definitely makes it feel older. The phone just in general feels short. It's wide enough, just short, and it also feels pretty chunky too. This isn't a light phone, nor is it a thin phone, at least considering how small it is. It was the best in 2011, but it isn't exactly optimal today. All things considered though, I'd say the 4S has actually aged pretty well in regard to the screen, as while it's still small, it looks really good. This was Apple's second phone that had a Retina display, and it shows with no visible pixels. I love my iPhone 3GS, but man is it hard to go back to. Everything on there is blurry and at a super low resolution, while the 4S gives clear, crisp images that have the same pixel density as the new iPhone XR. Pretty crazy that a phone from 2011 or even 2010 with the iPhone 4 has essentially the same display quality as one from 2018. Not to knock the XR, I think that it's fine. I think this more gives praise to the old phones than to insult the new ones. All that being said, while I think I could get used to the 4S's size if I used it for any longer, over the entirety of the week it felt foreign and wrong, but I digress. Battery life was about about 1,000 times better than I was expecting. It may be because this phone was extremely lightly used throughout its lifetime, but it actually pretty well lasted the day, which was really nice and surprising. I thought I'd have to bring a charger everywhere, but I totally didn't. Mind you, I wasn't using the phone too much for anything intensive because intensive tasks were slow, but I was still getting decent performance regardless. It's a small battery, but then again, it's a small phone, so I guess it makes sense that the power isn't a huge issue, at least for me. Well, anyways, I definitely need to throw that in there, and I bet most of you weren't expecting the battery of all things to be decent all these years later. I certainly wasn't, and maybe it's just this model, but man, it lasted pretty well. With this 4S, I had 16 gigabytes of storage, unlike last year when I had 8 gigs. I appreciated the extra space, but honestly didn't use it. But if this was my permanent phone, I'd want at least 16 gigs, as 8 is way too small, even for 7 years ago. And now I suppose we have come to the camera, and the camera is easily the best thing about this entire device, 100%. I'm gonna get to the biggest issue that comes with the 4S in a bit here, but first let's talk about easily the biggest positive. The camera is actually really good, like actually good. The 4S can take some stellar photos to the point that they actually don't look that out of place in the modern day. I'm thinking of doing a full video comparison of the 4S's camera versus the 10S's camera because I don't think they're quite as different as you would assume, or that I would assume for that matter. All these pictures you're seeing right now have been taken on the 4S and they actually look fine. Maybe not good by today's standards, but still what I would consider fine. They have a good balance between the background and foreground typically. In fact, I'll put up a few comparisons between the 4S and the 10S right now, and you might be surprised. I posted some more comparisons on Instagram if you're curious, by the way, so maybe go check it out over there, of course link below. But anyways, there's a very good reason the 4S has a half-decent camera, and it's because it had one of the biggest camera upgrades in iPhone history. It went from 5 megapixels on the iPhone 4 to 8 on the 4S, as well as getting full 1080p HD video. And video also looks pretty good, as you can see here. This is 1080p from a 2011 smartphone. My smartphone that I used in 2011, I don't even know if it was filming 360p. Video on there looked like crap. Now there are a few caveats that come with the camera of the 4S. Firstly, the crop factor is pretty terrible, and photos appear pretty zoomed in compared to the much wider 10S's lens, but that's actually not a huge deal because you can just take a step back. Secondly, all of these pretty good photos I've been showing have one thing in common, and that's that they were all taken outside in broad daylight. Problems start when you go inside or try to take photos at night. Because the sensor is so small and because it's fairly old technology, photos look ridiculously grainy with bad lighting, and they finally start to look their age. So if you somehow still have a 4S, try to take your family portraits outside during the day. Oh, and make sure you have HDR on. This is a must. Nowadays, HDR is kind of forgotten about by most, including myself. It's an automatic process done by your phone when it thinks it's needed, and that's that. But on the 4S, HDR isn't automatic. You have to turn it on yourself, and it really makes all the difference. If you didn't know, HDR stands for High Dynamic Range, and so by using it, you're kind of getting more of the background in your picture. So here's a picture that's fairly basic, right? It was taken in a parking lot of a park, and you can see a nice barn in the background with some clouds behind it. Cool. Well, here's that same picture with HDR, and bam! It surprises me how much of a difference HDR makes. So again, if you have the 4S still for some reason, always use HDR no matter what. It'll save a copy of the photo without HDR anyway, so even if it doesn't turn out, you have the option to go without it. And HDR doesn't always work. In low light situations, you'll often find that it'll make your picture look worse. For example, here's me holding a Mario amiibo, and you can see this is HDR and this is without HDR. HDR kind of seemed to make it look a little blurry for some reason. Not sure what happened there. Oh, also, if you have a 4S, never ever use the selfie camera. It's awful. Not much to say here other than that you can tell it only has 0.3 megapixels. this isn't a good selfie. Alright, let's move on. Overall, the camera is the absolute best thing about the iPhone 4S. It's held up shockingly well, and I was really happy with it. Mind you, I'd take the XS's camera any day, but from my personal experience with about 5 million different iPhones, I'd say the 4S's camera competes pretty well with most of them until the 6S, when they switched over to 12 megapixels. The 6, 5S, and 5 really don't look significantly better than the 4S, and that's impressive. But unfortunately, that's really the only impressive thing about this phone, and now it's time to talk about the absolute worst thing about the iPhone 4S. The A5 chipset and 512 megabytes of RAM. Now, if that meant nothing to you, congrats, you're not a nerd. Essentially, every year Apple releases a new processor with their iPhone. The XS has the A12, the 4S the A5. The A5 was the first to be dual-core, again, bear with me, and this led to it getting more software updates than iPhones generally were accustomed to. Technically, the 4S was able to handle both iOS 8 and 9, but in real-life usage, this really isn't the case. The real bottleneck was the 512 megabytes of RAM. This is about 1/8 of what the iPhone XS has and half of what the iPhone 5 has. The problem is that this low amount of memory made it so that the 4S could only do so much at once, and with the large amount of resources newer iOS versions require, it's no shock that the phone is slow, but man is it ever slow. The 4S is just painful to use. Living on iOS 8 this year was pretty darn bad, and iOS 9 last year was on a whole nother level. This phone never should have been updated past iOS 8, and I say iOS 8 because the 4S got iOS 7, and so it had to get iOS 8. Each iPhone needs to have at least one more version over its predecessor. That's just kind of how it works. But in all honesty, this phone really couldn't handle anything more than iOS 7 in my opinion. Everything takes forever. Opening settings shouldn't take 5 seconds. Swiping up the control center shouldn't take a century, and if I want to send a text message, it shouldn't be this hard. Even the most basic of apps are a huge pain on the 4S, and I think it's fair to say Apple really screwed up with its optimization here. Now you might say, you darn kid on your fancy iPhone XS, you're so accustomed to fast speeds, your generation is so impatient. Alright, fair enough I guess, but look at the iPhone 5S and how iOS 12 handles it. It's optimized. The 5S, a 5-year-old phone, runs pretty well on iOS 12. It really isn't that slow, but the 4S on iOS 8 or iOS 9 is a steaming pile of garbage. It's unbelievable that Apple let it get to this state, but they did, and I just think that's unacceptable. It's really too bad they didn't care as much about their older devices back then as they do now. You'd expect the 4S to be slow, but you wouldn't think that it'd be this slow. It's borderline unusable, and while the extra support does technically make it so that you can do almost anything, again I bring you back to the analogy I used at the start of the video. Using the 4S is like only being able to drive 30 kilometers an hour permanently. It's doable, but man, are you gonna be frustrated on the highway. Alright, that's enough of that. The 4S is super slow, that's really all you need to know, and that made it all the more painful considering I just came from the fastest smartphone in the world, the iPhone XS. And so now, let's finally talk about my experience specifically instead of just aspects of the phone. What was it like to have to adapt to such an old device? Well, it was tough. I think times like these really make me appreciate the privilege I have to be using the iPhone XS. It's a great phone, and the 4S, as good as it was, the keyword there is was. The first day was pretty simple. Everything was kind of fun, because sure, the 4S was slow, but the thing being slow happened to be this old nostalgia-inducing device. I was taking a lot of pictures and trying to do as much as possible on the 4S, watching Netflix with headphones, using Twitter, Instagram, Messenger, the whole 9 yards. I wanted the full experience, and at first I kind of liked it. It was something new, but it didn't take very long for the novelty to wear off and for the fascination to be replaced with frustration. This wasn't a phone I was simply reviewing, using for a day and then tossing it away. This is a phone I was actually living with. Everything had to be done on here, regardless of what it was. YouTube again is the worst app ever on the 4S, and to have it crash so many times made me want to throw the phone across the room. I think I ended up using the 4S a lot less than I would regularly use my smartphone, simply because of how limited it is. I felt caged in, like I couldn't really fully use it as much as I wanted to. You can tell a big shift on how I felt about the phone from my tweet on day 2 versus my tweet on day 4. On day 2, I basically say, hey, the 4S, it's not that bad, I'm getting used to it. I also say the battery is bad, but I've kind of rethought that since day 2. It actually did last me the day most of the time, so anyhow, irrelevant. Day 4, well, this is my tweet. The iPhone 4S wasn't a bad phone, but it is now, and really has been for the last 4 years or so since the release of iOS 8. You could argue even the release of iOS 7 kind of ruined it. I've always mostly said iOS 8 was okay, but after using it for a week, I'm starting to take that back. It might be better than iOS 9, but not by much, and my iPhone 4 on iOS 7 even feels a little bit faster. Perhaps part of the reason is that I'm on iOS 8.2 instead of 8.4.1, but as far as I know, there weren't any performance improvements made between those versions. Oh, and it's worth mentioning that I also couldn't use my Apple Watch with the 4S, which was kind of a pain. It was essentially useless for the entire week except for telling me the time, but I mean, who uses a watch to tell the time? By the end of the week, I was more than ready and genuinely excited to get back to my iPhone XS, and I can honestly say now that I'm back on the XS, it feels like a whole new phone. It's huge, at least compared to the 4S, and it can actually do things I want to do. I think I'm pretty done with the 4S for a good while, as it was a mostly very aggravating experience, but there were some positives that came out of it. It helped me appreciate what I have and reminded me that not everybody has the newest tech out there. And that's a pity considering smartphones are kind of a requirement now. Back when the 4S came out, you could totally live without a smartphone, but that isn't the case anymore. If any of you out there still has an iPhone 4S and are for some reason watching right now, first off, my condolences. And secondly, buy an iPhone 5S. You can find them for like $50 on eBay, and trust me when I say they will be about a million times better than what you have right now. And for the few of you that I see in the comment section of literally any video of me talking about the 4S, saying that the 4S isn't slow and that I'm wrong and stupid and a darn kid, I've walked the walk, my friend, and trust me when I say the 4S is unbearably slow. If you don't think so, you really need to try a better phone. I know some of you will probably ask whether or not I'll ever live with the iPhone 4S again, and frankly, I don't have an answer to that yet. If I did live with it again, I'd probably do it on iOS 6 just to change things up. It would be faster, but the trade-off is that I'd be using very old versions of apps, which may cause problems. Anyhow, if this video does well and there's a genuine interest there, maybe I'll consider giving it another go, or maybe I'll just live with a different phone altogether for a while, like the 5S or 6. That would be pretty interesting. Or hey, maybe I could live with the iPhone XS, or would that be a little bit silly? Alright, this video is getting really long, holy cow, so I'm gonna stop it right here, I think. To conclude, I lived with the iPhone 4S for a full week, and it was about as bad as I was expecting. The camera was good, but everything else was horrible. I think it's pretty fair to say the iPhone 4S is officially obsolete at this point, and I doubt I'll have too many people arguing with me there. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you've somehow made it this long, bravo to you, that's impressive. Maybe hit that like button for all this effort I've put into this video, and consider subscribing for more content just like this. I really have spent a lot of time on this video, so I hope you all enjoyed it. You can follow me over on Twitter and Instagram if you want to keep up with everything I'm doing, and with that all being said, I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and I will see you all next time.